not own or run media organizations. Debating this round are Team Estonia, who are proposing, as well as Team China, who are opposing. Please welcome all the speakers. The adjudicators for this round are Vivian from Germany, Irene from Scotland, and Nina from Sri Lanka. Each speaker has 8 minutes to deliver their speech. The end of each speech will be marked by a double mark. The first and seventh minute are protected from points of information and will be marked by 1 mark. The first or the second speaker of each side will deliver a 4-minute reply speech for their side. There are no points of information during reply speeches. I now invite the first speaker of the side for opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, in democracy we value pluralism and we allow different ideas. No matter in which end of the spectrum your ideas lay, you have a right to have those opinions. However, with state-run media, the state has the legitimacy to showcase some views to be correct or the objective truth which doesn't fulfill the principles of democracy. The state media, what it's always like, is it almost always supports the state's policies and their own political or the majority's views through 2 mechanisms. Firstly, if the state is your employer, you always want to create pro-state news because you want to get a promotion or succeed in that state-run media. Or secondly, with state funding, the state can dictate who is the head editor of a news agency, or the state can choose like which news get or do not get published. So through that, the state always has the legitimacy to cover or choose which news or pieces of news are going to be covered, and through that always going to be pro-state. We see that we shouldn't allow state funds to be spent to make people support their own views more, as similarly we don't allow ruling parties to use state funds to campaign for their own parties, because we see that on those grounds the principles of democracy are infringed, and this is something that we should not allow, no thank you, to happen. 3 arguments in our case today. Firstly, how we are protecting the democratic principle. Then secondly, how we can have better content, and through that people are going to vote based more on their views. And then thirdly, our second speaker is going to tell you how we can what are the explicit harms to political minorities, no thank you, through state-run media. Starting with our first argument about democratic principles. Go.
So, would you allow states to publish official statements and documentation regarding policies they make?
Yes, we would allow like official things, but we don't allow like coverage of some issues, because we see that the news outlets are always going to cover pieces of news in their ways or like through some sort of a political view, and we see that this is the explicit harm because they aren't just like objective pieces of truth, but they are covered through one certain political view. Starting with my first argument. So we're talking about democratic states, so we have to defend the democratic principle, and because we're talking about the media has huge power to influence the views, and it often influences the way people vote and how they're supporting their own views, and the reason why we need to talk about media. The democratic principles that we defend today are the following. Firstly, we defend fair representation of all views, and then secondly, how one political view should not be more legitimate based on the amount or the agent who is supporting those political views. Now, talking about how the state is infringing those, how the state is infringing those democratic principles. So we say that the state is often felt felt like as like some extreme authority, or that they have more knowledge and they have more power and they're more correct in some instances. How this translates to state media is in those cases the state media is often believed more and thought that this is in some cases more correct than like private companies who you doubt more. So in those instances, because the state can influence or like what news are going to be published just because they can like choose who the head editor of a news agency is, no thank you, then they can like firstly dictate what is the media like or what are the pieces of news produced like, and then secondly people are more likely to believe those cases because they feel that the state has more authority, especially when you're just like a young person creating your political views and you aren't completely sure that you have always lived in a state that is like democratic, should be nice to you, you're always going to believe the state more, and hence the state has more authority over you. Now why we say that this is extremely bad for people to creating those views is firstly it's just infringing on the principle of democracy, because some views are always going to be subsidized just because the state is supporting them or the majority of people are supporting them, hence they aren't fairly represented and one political view seems to be more correct, no thank you. And secondly, we cannot have self-determination, or you cannot really choose what your views or principles that you support are like just because like the state kind of is almost coercing you to believing some types of media or some types of political views more just because they have more power over you. You have getting false perception of what is right for yourself. So we say that the comparative is that it's okay to watch Fox News if you really believe that this is correct, and if you think that, or if you identify yourself with the things that Fox Media is producing, no thank you. However, we say that it's not principally right to believe or just look at Fox Media because if the state told that this is correct and you need to believe it and this is the ultimate truth. We say that like believing in like right or alt-right media, even if that is correct, when you're choosing that yourself and it isn't dictated by the state and state saying that this is the correct thing that you need to do. No thank you. And we say that through that the state is actually infringing on the principle of democracy, something that we should not allow with this media. Moving on to my second argument on how we can have better content and people believing more or people making better decisions for themselves. So we say that like there are two mechanisms on how we can have better democracy through better content. Firstly, when we have more coverage on a wider set of issues, and then secondly, when people are more aware of the nature of the content and what actually the media is behind. Firstly, talking about the like better or more wider content. We said that now coverage is going to be based on a wider spectrum, of political views. No, thank you, because there are going to be competing news agencies and one type of political view, even if it's the majorities, isn't going to be subsidized by the state, so we can have a wider spectrum of ideas going to be represented. Furthermore, we say that the coverage on like issues or problems in the state is going to be wider as the state now, like for example, like some sort of like what is currently happening is the state is only producing some certain types of media. For example, when talking about the BBC, the coverage they have of Brexit is always going to be no thank you, or it's always that hard Brexit is very negative because Theresa May is supporting soft Brexit. However, we say that this isn't just like one legitimate view, and we aren't saying that the people who are supporting hard Brexit somehow have wrong ideas, but we say that the risk with state media is that they are like going to support some certain types of views. We say that BBC might be the best example that team opposition is supporting. However, when we're talking about Polish TV, for example, that is explicitly often like types of propaganda or supporting views that aren't like generally we don't in the West believe that are going to be correct, no thank you, or like good views. So we see that this is the risk that is always going to be there with state media because it doesn't. The opposition has to prove to us why it is always objective in order to win this motion. We say that it isn't, and the state has the power to influence it. What is going to happen now on our side, no thank you, is the coverage on issues is going to be wider. For example, in times when the state is doing something wrong or there is going to be like a scandal or something is happening. In state media, they have no incentive to cover issues that make the state seem bad. This is something that is explicitly going to change on our side because firstly, when you don't have like the state is not your employer, you're more likely to cover issues that are against the state. Or secondly, you're going to like get views if you cover an issue that is, for example, like about state doing something badly. So we see that and furthermore, it reaches more people as the state is not like legitimizing some certain types of like media, which means that like more issues are going to get more coverage because there isn't like one state legitimizing it and people are more aware. Secondly, how people can be more aware is because you now know what is the agent or who is producing this like private media. There isn't one state saying that this is correct. However, you know that like Fox Media is always producing right-wing or like more right views and more right media, and CNN in the US is more leftist. And everyone in the US like knows this type of information. And now when you're going to consume it, you will be more aware of what is the political agenda that these private companies are producing, and what are the views or what are the beliefs behind this media, and when the piece of news is somehow through that cover. Which we get is that now people are going to vote more in their interest, because the principle of democracy and how you can vote the best is when you're informed and when you know what is going on and when you know which political issues are going to be covered. And we say that the state is infringing upon that principle of democracy, something that we defend in proposition, and for all of those reasons, vote Team Estonia.
Having lived in both China and the USA, I think I learned a very important lesson. And that was my ability to differentiate news in democracies and news in autocracies. And the difference then was, if you took examples like the Polish TV or maybe China Daily in China, when you have extremely propagandist TV and you limit the airtime of any other form of free speech, we think that was erring on the side of autocracy and skewed away from today's debate. Because one of the key problems in Estonia's case was if you were to listen to the rhetoric that they told you when it came to the worst case scenarios that they tried to paint, those examples were probably examples that lied outside of democracies. Those were countries that did not support free speech, and those were countries that intentionally undermined any sort of political opposition to the standing parties. We think in those examples, those were probably not the democracies this debate was supposed to be about. But even if that were true, we're going to engage you on those grounds anyways, in two ways. Firstly, why is it principally justified in that in democracies the government should be providing state to those who have a right to consume it? Secondly, why government media fills an important niche in media that we think is important to protecting the free speech that they want to talk about on their side. What is our stance on team opposition? Twofold. Firstly, we think that for-profit news organizations are not inherently bad, but we think that state organizations have a unique incentive to fill in the gaps that for-profit organizations do not fill in. Secondly, we stand for things like free speech regulations and the importance in protecting media organizations, for-profit or non-for-profit, and existing in the same sphere as government media can in the status quo. So then, before I move on to substantive, I just want to have 2 points of extraneous rebuttal. The rest will be directly clashed within our substantives. The first thing I want to note is just a characterization of what individuals are like in democracies. We think these individuals are largely people that are, yes, partisan, but also oftentimes critical and aware of state overreach. That is why democracies oftentimes prioritize things like checks and balances, because the individuals that live under these governmental regimes understand that they, as individuals, need to have control over the government themselves. This, importantly, takes down the characterization that is fundamental to their first argument. That is to say, the idea that people are over-reliant and believe in the government far too much. We think that is simply just not true when it comes to the context of democracies and the people who live within them as a whole. But secondly, even if we were going to buy this analysis, and we were to assume that most individuals acted like sheep, why is it still then that they have contradicted themselves? We asked them in a POI whether or not they would bar politicians from making official statements or just making speeches in general. Because this was incredibly important. Because we think politicians making speeches open on air or on news or on TV in general has the exact same effect as state-run media, because these are just as likely going to be partisan, and they're just as likely going to be legitimized by the stances of the government. Problematically then, they told us that they wouldn't ban these types of things. We think that on a principled level, they then contradicted themselves. Because just when these individuals are just as likely going to be as influential as state-run media, they're likely to have the same pro-establishment stances as state-run media, we think it's contradictory for them to allow these politicians to continue to make their own statements. Why then is it that this is principally justified, our first substance? We think there's two things under this. Firstly, that individuals have a right to consume these types of media, and secondly, that the government has a burden to provide it. First then, why is it that individuals have a right to consume this? And we think PM did a lot of the analysis for us when they told us that democracies tend to stand for a variety of different beliefs. Importantly, this means that democracies stand for the idea that there's no correct way of consuming media. That is why we allow for things like partisanship media to exist. That is why we don't bar individuals from consuming tabloids, regardless of whether or not those are healthy for their minds. We think this is the same reason why conservatives are allowed to watch things like Fox News and liberals are allowed to watch things like CNN, and we never force them to cross these borders. Why then is this incredibly important? Because we think, regardless of the pro-establishment characterization that they may have given us about state-run media, that it is still a right for individuals to be able to consume this type of media. Because pro-establishment, just like being a liberal or a conservative, is just another type of preference. That is just another political preference, and we think it is perfectly legitimized that individuals can consume state media if being supportive of the state is the political view that they themselves have. Secondly, why then is there a burden to provide? We think democracies tend to value the ability for individuals to access free information. That is why we have things like freedom of press and freedom of media. That is why we allow individuals to express their ideas both on a media platform or on an individual platform. Importantly, this necessarily means we think governments that are democracies oftentimes have an obligation, and I'll take you in a second, to provide the information that allows these individuals to make the informed choices within democracies. Sure.
The state's coverage of news is always going to be subjective and is always going to protect some sort of political stance. Our analysis was that this is bad because the state has some sort of supremacy in this
Okay, yeah, I already addressed this. Firstly, we tell you that most people don't view the state as having an overpowering control over what is right and what is wrong. That is why you're allowed to vote, and that is why you believe in specific parties. But secondly, even if that was true, we would then mean that we think that is analysis to show why states should never be able to make any statement whatsoever, because it necessarily overcrowds other things that the people in the country might believe in. So then, secondly, why is it that government media fills an important niche in media reporting? We think the problem on their side, or the counterfactual, would be one in which only for-profit or even non-profit news organizations exist. And the problem then lies in the fact that there is a core incentive in these organizations to earn money. That is to say, they have corporate interests because they are, at the end of the day, corporations. Why then is this problematic? We think it means that they have an incentive to create and establish large and loyal consumer bases. They oftentimes will then prioritize confirmation over transparency. Why is that so? Because it's most profitable to have individuals continually being willing to read your news or consume the media that you produce. That necessarily means that news have an incentive to play into the confirmation biases of individuals, giving them news that they're willing to agree with and they're willing to read to the fullest extent. This is why a problematic incentive, what then are the impacts of this sort of problematic incentive structure? We think it comes fourfold. Firstly, that media oftentimes becomes polarized in partisanship. That is to say, in instances like how CNN will repeatedly vilify Trump regardless of whether or not he's doing good things. And at the same time, Fox is willing to defend Trump regardless of whether or not the things that they do are things that are justified in their own opinion. We think it means that necessarily media sources oftentimes have to take very hard political stances because that is the only way they can guarantee a stable revenue source from the followings that they've created. Secondly, that oftentimes you prioritize things that are attention-grabbing over important issues, things that people are willing to click into rather than things that they necessarily probably want to or need to read. But thirdly, even if the stories that are important are being broadcasted, oftentimes they're sensationalized and they're oftentimes reduced or distorted towards one political preference. Because even the most important stories need to be read by a certain voter base, and that is the voter base that you want to target. But fourthly, oftentimes news organizations have an incentive to attack each other. That is to say, CNN has an incentive to paint Fox as an untrustable news source because that is a way that they're able to gain loyalty and seem as more legitimate. What then is a change? What we add to media is a centrist and more accurate perspective. That is to say, state media doesn't have the incentive to pursue profits like other media sources do, because they're funded regardless by the state, regardless of their performance. Importantly, this means that firstly, more people are able to consume media that is neutral, because oftentimes we think in the context of modern democracy, there's a sort of disenchantment with strongly partisan media. We think individuals then are more willing to buy into centrist media or neutral media that is more likely to broadcast the political views that they have. Examples being like Reuters in America or BBC in Britain. We think importantly this necessarily means that people are more able to gain access to media and media that is able to represent the truth of what is happening rather than the facade that may happen from for-profit organizations. Because of that, we're very proud to oppose.
would like to thank the first speaker of the side opposition for their speech and would like to invite the second speaker of the side proposition to deliver their speech.
Team Estonia doesn't protect a case of the state being bad. It protects a case of the state being an authority for its people. It protects a case in which the state can dictate what the people believe and thus take away their self-determination about what kind of information they want to consume, what kind of work they want to believe in, and what kind of change do they want to make. In this speech, probably with one point of extreme use of the characterization that they try to impose on us, then moving into two areas of clashing this debate. First, talking about the democratic principles that never got a strong reputation from Team China, then moving into the second point about what's going to be the content like and what kind of content we want from media outlets in our world, and then finally telling you about the explicit harms on social and political minorities and how they are explicitly harmed under the case from Team China. Moving on to the first point of rebuttal. So we get from them is that we are talking about the worst case scenarios under our side. They say that, for example, Poland is more autocratic than these democratic. We don't agree with this. Firstly, we don't agree with this because Poland is a democracy. People can go choose, can vote, can choose the kind of party that has power in those instances. Poland is discussed more autocratic than some other democratic nations because of the fact that it can influence its media to such a large extent. Give power to only this one party that is in power. Say that all of the things that this party say are more true than the ideas of other parties. Their examples and the way that they try to lay these examples down are negative for their side. It proves that some bad parties gain power in these nations and they can turn to autocracy instead of being democratic. But it's also an untrue answer. We told you about other examples as well besides Poland. For example, Brexit, like the way Brexit discussion are portrayed in UK media. This isn't an undemocratic country, and we think that they would like to agree with this on this side. They need to prove to you why, for example, people can be forced into believing some things about Brexit, and why other things can be pushed out of the things that they see, can be told to them to be wrong, and why people can't hold those opinions. We don't think that Team China has dealt with the crux and the bulk of our case. Starting with the first point of clash about democratic principles. We get two answers from Team China. Firstly, they tell us that individuals understand that they can take down the government, or they have some power over the government, and question the idea of authority that we bring to you from Team Estonia. This is not inherently true. Notice that people understand the fact that the state runs its life. They need to give taxes to the state, give their private property away because of the fact that the state has this legitimacy and extreme power over them. The state can give jobs to them, the state can guarantee them health insurance, can say what kind of world they are going to be living in, can dictate the way that their society looks like. The state is the one running laws and making this country look the way that the country is looking. People probably have an idea of the fact that the state has extreme power and that the state is the one actually pushing changes. When they tell you about the fact that people go voting and thus they understand that the state doesn't have legitimacy of power, and this is negative to their side. People are going to voting exactly because of the fact that they understand that the state has this power. They want some kind of checks and balances to influence the way that the state has this power over them. They want to choose a kind of state that makes all of the decisions for them, and they want to have some kind of balance in this situation. If you go voting because of exactly the reasons that they try to use as reputation. But furthermore, what we hear from them is that we contradict ourselves when we say that official reports are fine. Two answers to this. Firstly, these official reports describe the law, and we don't think that they have any amount of the same bias that we are describing inside proposition. They are made to describe the law, describe the discussion that took place in the government, which is inherently going to be more neutral and giving less bias to some groups. But furthermore, notice that the fact that a politician can make statements doesn't have the same level of authority. We say that the state as a whole has more authority than one politician making some kind of statement, and they need to show that if they think that the state doesn't have any authority, then all of these politicians have a huge level of authority over the people that live in our societies. Second point of clash, what is this concept going to look like, and why do we think that the content on side proposition is better? Before that, go.
So, your contention is that the state is so overwhelmingly powerful that people essentially cannot reject their views when they have these media organizations in place. If that's true, why don't incumbents win every election cycle?
Because we think that the state currently can force some kind of ideas onto them, but we think that we still have people who can have some kind of their own ideas. We don't understand what are you trying to say. You have many countries where we have one side that's constantly winning. The fact that the US, for example, has only two parties and thus they are constantly changing, that's only one example of the spectrum, but in many cases they are constantly being either left-wing or right-wing. Many societies in the world are not constantly changing. We see that, for example, in the UK, Labour is only now coming up, but they have been conservative for a very long time. We see that in most societies, for example, in Germany, Merkel running for the fourth term or whatever. Many countries remain the same political stance for a very long time. Moving on to the second point of clash. We hear from them that some people can already consume tabloids and conservatives can already consume, for example, Fox News. We think that the state-for-state media has very little power. It's the only state in which people can watch those Fox News. In the United States, there is very little power for the state to have this strong state media because they only have two parties and they can't really have a state-run media organization because we're constantly having to change their stance once the elections change for a different party. We're talking about cases where there are many where the rhetoric of the state is usually the same and doesn't really change as much. They're choosing the most extreme cases and only talking about those things. It's eventually the profit incentives make them prioritize confirmation of good information. Two answers. Firstly, if people want to consume state media as they say, then these private owners need to rise to the occasion that the state media has already set. In this where people actually like the state media, and they're going to want these private providers to provide the same level of information. They are mixing up the fact that we have two groups in the society, and one of them is already watching those fake news and clickbait news, and they are going to do the same thing on their side. The people who are currently watching state media are going to want the same level of information, even when state media exists, and thus we think that they are going to have profit incentives as little weight in this debate. They then say to you that they make enemies out of each other, which we don't think is actually going to have much impact because they lack the same amount of legitimacy as the state, but also in the long term people are going to be able to choose their own media, so the fact that these news outlets are forcing them to choose one way or the other isn't going to have as much impact because they can choose the form of media they are following in the first place. Finally, they tell you that the neutral media is the one that's most popular, but then again, go into the characterization that most people want to watch Fox News, for example, which isn't very neutral. I think it's more like that you can choose the kind of media that you want to pursue. It doesn't have to be neutral, as long as it confirms the biases and the information that you want to consume, and gives you the analysis that you want to receive. Finally, moving on to an extension of social and political minorities. We have already told that the state has the ability to legitimize a state of views. Many groups don't get a way to respond to that legitimacy. They are always told by the state that they are wrong and that they can never be in a way in a position of power when the things that they say are also right. Under the status quo, they can't make their voice be heard because the state simply has this huge legitimacy over them. They can't get access to the media market because everyone would reject them because their ideas are illegitimate, and even if those ideas exist in the current media market, then the legitimacy isn't given to those ideas because the state has the power to construct what is normal and what is not. This means that some voices are never heard. They are always characterized as abnormal and irrelevant. This is bad for these groups. I think there are two groups that we see in these cases losing out. Firstly, we see social groups. They are going to feel like they are not a legitimate part of the society, and this is something that continues on the side of opposition. We also think that shifts can be created much faster in society. We can give much stronger societal shifts to the LGBT community, for example, or the women in our society, because the state can't construct what's normal and what is not. We think that abortion is likely to come under our side to the Polish women, because they can see that we have a power over the state, and the state doesn't have the legitimacy to say that abortion is always wrong. But also the political groups, for example, the far-right people, have more legitimacy in their cases and are less likely to radicalize even further, thus meaning they have more stability inside the state. I think the state shouldn't abuse its authority, and for all of these reasons, I'm very happy to propose that.
This speech lasts for 8 minutes and 21 seconds. Alright. So I would like to thank the second speaker.
I guess this doesn't happen very often, but I want to clarify the world that they are describing for you. Because they're describing a world where the state has overwhelming power and influence over individuals, where the words of the state and policies released by the state, even if it's not just politicians, are so overwhelmingly powerful that individuals feel compelled to act in regard to the state, where individuals probably shouldn't have free press either way if the state is so tyrannical, where it's probably not a true democracy. We say that democracies stand for liberal ideals, they stand for the freedom of speech, they stand for the freedom of press, and the world that they are describing is probably not one that we are talking about in this debate. I want to ask 3 questions in this speech. Firstly, what are the characteristics of state media? Secondly, is it principally justified to have state media? And in there I'll fit an extra piece of substantive about how we have a better justification in terms of allowing state media, in terms of accountability, even in their best case. And finally, how do we create a more informed electorate? Firstly, what are the characteristics of state media? The first thing I want to deal with here is their strange extension about minorities. Now, it's strange because minorities are not clearly better off on their side of the house. We would contest, firstly, that states don't have the massive incentives that they would say to, ostracize minorities, because generally states want to get re-elected, even if their characterizations are true. So ostracizing them and leaving them out of the media doesn't sound like a very good idea. On the comparative, Fox News seems to be a lot more happy to leave these people out. But also, it's just not clear why they have a very strong incentive to do this. So if I can prove in my extension and in the characterization of state media that they have no reason to be extremely partisan, we take down this point as well. So, firstly, why does this tend to be less partisan than other media sources? The first reason is because they ignore the characterization that Brian gave you, that these were separate from the government. Just because it's owned by the government does not mean that Theresa May is literally telling BBC what to publish. Very often what happens is you have an independent board of individuals who is running this company, like BBC, who gets funding from the government but is never told what the government wants to do. And this makes a lot of sense, right? Because politicians generally don't want to be seen as breaking down the instruments of democracy. This is my second rebuttal, because generally, with very few exceptions, politicians want to be seen as upholding the principles of democracy to the extent that even if they have to give up some political advantages to do that. Why? Because being seen as anti-democratic is very, very bad for your image. Thirdly, this already works, right? If it's true that governments are so manipulative on their side of the house, then school curriculum is probably indoctrinating kids already. I don't seem to see that happening on their side of the house. So it's less partisan on our side of the house. On the comparative, we say that other independent media organizations often have an incentive to politicize media and often have an incentive to vilify people and organizations on the other side to build a more loyal base. Secondly, they're more willing to air less flashy topics for the simple reason that Fox News might not air it, or CNN might not air it, because that might not get you clicks. However, the government will air it because they do not need the revenue that comes from clicks or comes from subscribers. So it means that on net, maybe not all people will click into it, but stories about climate change, stories about human slavery, stories that are not always as flashy will get far more news on our side of the house. They said other media will rise to the occasion and present these types of things because people will demand it. I would note that the competition that they talk about only exists on our side of the house when the state media exists to give them that competition. So independent media wouldn't change on their side because there's no competition to speak of. Thirdly, we're far more inclusive in terms of what media we're talking about because there's no incentive to vilify. So the so what of this argument is that it takes down their entire case because their characterization is based on the idea that the state is extremely exclusive and hateful. Now, let's talk about the principle. Essentially what they tell us is that the state has authority and that state media is incredibly coercive. Firstly, it's not coercive as a fact of democracy. The ideals behind democracy, a real democracy in my view, is that people can choose and people are not sheeple that are coerced by state media. And I would note that in their side of the world, I would question why Theresa May struggled to form a government even though she was already winning, even though she purportedly has power over the BBC. And the clear reason why is not because, there are some very vigorous activists that don't listen to the state and are very evil. It's probably that group of people are quite a normal group of people that don't all bow down to the state. Some people are patriotic, some people are not. We would say that falls along the individual person's choice. Also on Brexit, I would say that the Prime Minister during the time that Brexit was enacted was against Brexit, so generally that's against you as well. Then, the second rebuttal is, why news? Because we told you that anything that the state does, it's not just about politicians making statements. Any official statement by the state should oppress everyone as well, but they don't ban those things as well. I would note that these things tend to be even more coercive if you're going to talk about that, because they're not as direct. Media is very hard to distort very accurately, and that's why they give you no examples of it. But when you're making a public statement with regard to a policy, it's very easy for you to say, this policy is very, very good. No. And no, even if they do get that coercion on their side of the house, it's unlikely then that we're talking about democracy. Secondly, you can subscribe to Fox if you believe them. The thing is, I will prove to you right now why Fox is even more coercive than media institutions. And the reason why is because we would know that children don't form their views based off a blank slate. People form their views based on the communities around them and based on the media organizations that they currently subscribe to. So if you subscribe to Fox News, or that happens to be the first media outlet that your parents introduce you to, then it's very hard to get out of that loop of Fox News, given the incentives that I talked about earlier. Why Fox News has an incentive to grab you in and not expose you to any other sources and say that other sources are evil. On the comparison, right, governments have very little incentive to ostracize you from other news sources. They have an incentive to make you more informed, and I would say that that's less coercive on their side of the house. Finally, they didn't respond to the point about duty that Brian brought you. We think that governments should spread information that was unresponded to as a whole. Note this takes out their entire case, but I'll move on to my new substantive now because this is important, and sorry, they will take out their case even in their best case. So let's assume, even in their absolute best case, the government has absolute control over the media and creates some sort of propaganda. Why do we still win this justification? Because the accountability mechanism for governments is better than that for the media. Why? This is why we allow for public schools along with private schools, because we allow for governments to control that curriculum, we allow for that accountability mechanism. Here are two reasons why independent news outlets are not accountable. Firstly, they're very often funded by billionaires or massive conglomerations of independent news sources, which means that they're able to back themselves even if there's a little bit of backlash against one of their news articles. Secondly, and more importantly, they are only responsive to their own audiences. They are not responsive to people who disagree with them, as governments are in democracies. Yes?
If the state is not a coercive mechanism, then why do people in our societies pay taxes or follow laws, for example?
Okay, there's a difference between coercive mechanism, as in you pay taxes or else you get fined, and a difference between read the news and you have to subscribe to the state. Because the second one is clearly an absurd mechanism. I don't see anyone reading the BBC or Polish news and saying, I must bow down to the president now. That doesn't make any sense. So crucially, in terms of that justification, news outlets are even less accountable. At the very least with the state, we can hold them to account by voting them in or out of office. Note that's the premise of democracy. Finally, how do we get a more informed electorate? First thing that we told you was accessibility. We would note that this is empirically true already. The BBC is one of the most widely assessed forms of media in the world, which is simply to say that the media is often seen as a game of mudslinging that people don't want to involve themselves with when it comes to the two media organizations that hate each other and always insult each other. But when it comes to state media, they have no incentive to do that, and as a result, people are more likely to buy into it. Secondly, for the reason of paywalls, that very often media incentives mean that you can't allow everyone to access them. And thirdly, because of the appeal to the broad group that we've been talking about all down our bench. Applying another source means that you get far more information. It is justified to have this source. We clearly won this case. Very proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the second speaker of the side opposition for their speech, and would like to invite the third speaker of the side of opposition to deliver their speech.
ruling political party is a good one and an effective one and should also be voted in the next elections. We give you many mechanisms how, for the fact that if you're a journalist and you want to get a promotion, then it is in your own interest to provide very pro-state media, because this is what is expected of you. Or the fact that some sort of political parties or people in that can choose head editors of these media organisations, which means that it is very likely that the people who are going to be dictating what sort of news is going to be broadcast and what extent that is going to get coverage, it is very likely that it's going to be pro-state and there is an incentive for this. Note that this also isn't transparent at all. No one actually knows how head editors are chosen. No one is actually, like most of the populace, isn't very aware of how these might be biased, which means we don't believe that political parties don't have an incentive to actually make sure that this is pro-state. But also note that our argumentation doesn't rely on some sort of behind the curtain scheme. It is just how these news organisations will systemically work, which means that this isn't going to be seen as something inherently negative. I want to talk about two things in my speech. Firstly, I want to look at what is the actual state like and what is the media like that the state is going to be providing. And then secondly, I want to look at why are private companies very effective at providing the news under this, this also clashes with their extension. But first off, what is the state like in this media? In their first speech, they said that Poland is not part of this debate. But as we said, we see that this media, the state media organisation, was a mechanism through which Poland was able to become more autocratic because it could influence the overall ideas of its populace to suit its own agendas. This is a more extreme example, but this is also something that they have to deal with because the risk of this happening exists in every single other state when you have these media organisations, and this is a huge harm which they haven't really dealt with. But then they say that people are critical and they know when the state might not be objective. Note that it is extremely hard to understand when some sort of news coverage might be biased. We're not talking about fake news here, we're talking about subtle emotional coverage, or the sort of words that you might use, for example, when you're covering terrorism, for example. We also talked about the fact that BBC is characterising hard Brexit as something inherently negative, or with no deal's reason this is something inherently bad. And we think that, but this is an overall legitimate view that people might have, especially when we take into account that, according to the referendum, many people actually supported this Brexit, and now the overall state, media organisation, is characterising this as something that is negative, and we don't think that this is something that is very justified. And it's obviously an example of how people don't it's not inherently fake or it's not inherently wrong, but the state is giving legitimacy to a single opinion and to a single view, which is now which many people take as at face value as this is some sort of truth, and this is where all of our harms come from, and also why this isn't justified, an argument that hasn't really been responded to. If you look at either of their speeches, why the state should never give some sort of legitimacy or supremacy to a single opinion, which it always has to do, because you can't provide news without giving some sort of subjective material or emotional context with that. No, thank you. But then they say that state statements have the same effect if politicians can protect their views, which is probably ridiculous. Obviously, politicians have to protect their views, but we think that the reason why this is different is because the perverse incentives are much clearer in this context. Obviously, a politician who is protecting their views, everyone understands that he is biased, and obviously this is his overall political stance. We think that the state media, however, is removed from a specific identity much more, while still retaining authority of a better news group, as this has the overall legitimacy of a state. And we think that people are much more critical of private news companies. We think that people much more understand that private news companies are obviously catering to a single specific political agenda. This is much less understood during a state-run media organisation. And this is all important when we talk about the justification, where the fact that we talked about people that say should not give supremacy or legitimacy to any sort of state-run media or news, because it's hard to achieve self-determination for people. People don't understand anymore people don't have as much ability to choose what sort of news they're providing, or that they're being fed some sort of opinion without understanding that this isn't objective truth. We do their own analysis about the fact that people might be trusting in the middle ground more, and now might be trusting the state media more. Enforces our own arguments about how people don't have that self-determination anymore, because these people are now being fed this truth and are being believed, and are being told to believe that this is something that is inherently true. And also, we think that our extension of our political minorities also still stands, Because when they talk about the fact that states don't want to ostracize minorities, they want to get re-elected, then many minorities are ostracized by society. We think that before the overall, the state also starts to support them, they're not going to get that coverage. But we think that it's much more likely that private companies might give them that coverage, as many minorities often aren't a minority in the whole populace, which means that competition means that it's more likely they're going to get coverage. Now let's move on to the second one, it's about why are private companies effective at providing news? Yes.
In order for the media to sway the public's opinion in a literally coercive way, you would probably need to adopt some pretty overt mechanisms, such as only supporting a certain policy or only punishing
This
positive
is not what we have analysed. We have talked about the fact that you are supporting some sort of political stance subtly. The BBC is more left wing, and this in itself is supporting some sort of political stance and giving more merit to it. Now let's look at why are private companies more effective at providing news. We think that when they talk about the fact that private companies play into confirmation biases and always take hard political stances, then firstly, we think this lacks comparative merit, as the state media will always also support some sort of specific stance. The BBC is always going to be a bit more left-wing than centrist. But secondly, we don't believe that private news is always going to be politically extremist. We think that competition means that they cater to their overall, the society that is in them, and that these news media are going to be a reflection of the overall ideas of that society, which means that if you're going to have more people who are centrist or a bit less left than these news media are going to cater to that. No, thank you. And they say that private companies also use emotional coverage, but we think that this happens under them as well. We talked about that there exist two groups in a society. Firstly, those that want headlines and want emotional coverage, and secondly, those that want lots of analysis or large articles like in The Economist. We think that competition means that these private providers will always also cater to the group who wants news with less emotional coverage, which means that, no thank you, private companies are always going to be catering to this part as well. And we think that under our side, there still exists some sort of private companies who do so-called good news. But when they talk about the fact that the states have no incentive to talk badly of other media, then this is just our point that states don't have to do this because they have supremacy over other media, and they don't have to actually prove this. Now, let's talk about another important way, which is that people make better political decisions. And this is because there is more criticism for the state overall. And the comparative is that under them, there will always exist a large media organisation that very likely is going to protect the state, which means that if the state does something bad, then it is very unlikely, then proportionally, a lot more of the media will be protecting the state in that example than under us, which means there is more criticism for the state. This inherently means that people are more informed of what is overall going on in their society, which means they can make better political decisions in their society. People are more informed. Even if some sort of private parties might also be pro-state, then you know the agenda of those private news media, which means that you're still more knowledgeable of what might be going on in your state, which means that people make better political decisions. And on a societal level, our overall democracy is much better enforced if people can make those informed decisions. People know when the state has made some sort of mistake a lot better under our side. For all of these reasons, please propose. Thank you.
So this speech was 8 minutes. I would like to thank the third speaker of the side proposition for their speech, and would like to invite the third speaker of the side opposition to deliver their speech.
team proposition is a world that simply does not exist. And the reason why is because their whole case is premised on a huge contradiction. Because in their speaker, they tell us the biases of state news are extremely subtle, to the point at which you cannot even tell they are there. But at the same time, these very subtle biases seem to overtly brainwash everyone into sheeple of the state. We told you that that type of brainwashing could never occur given the characterization they gave us. But more importantly, we told you that if these biases existed within the context of state media, they would also exist in the context of private media. And this is where our extension became very important. Because if there were going to be coercive biases on both sides of the house, we would prefer a system of media that there was some accountability to, particularly for those who aren't billionaires, who aren't shareholders of Fox News or our side. I have two questions in this speech. One, whether it's principally just to consume this type of media, and secondly, who provides more accurate media on their side of the house. So first, let's talk about the right to consume. But before I move into this, I first want to characterize the nature of individuals in democracy, because we have two very different characterizations of democracy. They tell us that in the extreme circumstances of Poland, we have to engage with Poland because it's called a democracy. We told you that even if Poland is nominally a democracy, that these pseudo-democracies don't change on either side of the house. Why? Because if they're so willing to forward a state agenda, they will simply do other things like censoring anti-establishment media, even if they don't have their own platform. So they will achieve their own ends on their side of the house. And the reason why that's the case is because democratic norms don't apply in the pseudo-democracies they're talking about. We engage them on their best, and we showed you how there's absolutely no change. But what's more important is they never actually engaged in the vast majority of this debate. Because we told you, in the vast majority of circumstances, from the United States to the UK, that the vast majority of people were not so invested in the state. And their only analysis as to why people were so invested into the state was they pay taxes, so there's some type of legitimacy to the state. Like, it just doesn't make any sense, because the type of legitimacy that is derived from the state from paying taxes is distinct from buying into everything they say. But more importantly, they're simply not true, because the state is clearly viewed with suspicion in democracies around the world. Note the fact that in places like America, people routinely protest against state policy. That's why millions of people took the streets and protested against things like the travel ban when they were implemented. Because state policy isn't just accepted by people, it is something that is heavily contested in democracies, because the state is viewed with suspicion, because the power rests with the people, not with a centralized government. No response to any of that. All they told us was there was some type of coercion that is involved. Yes, we agree. But if that coercion was to be involved, we said private media would be equally coercive. And because of that, it means that on our side of the house, there was incentives for state media to be accountable. Because you cannot prove biased media, because what that means is you alienate a vast majority of your voter base, because they're not going to vote for you anymore. Finally, we told you about the idea of the principal contradiction. And in third, they finally tried to respond to it by saying incentives are more obvious with politicians. We have two responses. Number one, if these incentives are less obvious, then they affect people far less. Secondly, if these incentives are so clear, then people will clearly be able to tell. Just because you don't have liberal stamped on your forehead doesn't mean people can't tell your media is liberal if you're supporting a particular viewpoint unconditionally. No response to any of that. Because ultimately, they never responded to what our principle was. We told you, one, that democracy should never prescribe systems of belief, but two, that democracies which value the freedom of information should and have a priority to provide this information to other people. No response to this principle at all, because we said, even in their best case scenario, pro-establishment ideas were still equally pro-establishment. And what they never characterized to us was why private media was so particularly uncoercive. Because people's beliefs aren't shaped by free choice. They're shaped by the conditions they grow up with. They're shaped by the communities that tell them you should be conservative, which is why things aren't free on their side of the house either. Second question, who provides more accurate media? Before that, yes.
You can still consume media that is similar to the majority's views. Why is the state legitimizing that media so crucial in consuming it?
Okay, I'll talk about why there are actually structural incentives why the state won't actually emphasize that views of the majority. I'll move into that later. But there are two important things that they never understood when they talked about media. Number one, they never dealt with what the comparative was that we told you about all the perverse incentives that exist. But secondly, they never dealt with the fact that this debate did not exist in a dichotomy. That on our side of the house, we would have every benefit they listed of private media, but they would exist in tandem with the state-owned media. More importantly, we told you the state-owned media actually enhanced private media. Why? Because it provided the competition that means that media have to compete to be more accurate, or else you lose credibility. What did they tell us? They told us that media will always be pro-establishment when it comes from the state. I'm sorry, but this is intellectually dishonest for them to claim that media always aligns with the ruling party, because we gave you 3 responses that they did not talk about. Number 1, we told you that these types of media are independent from the government, that even though they were owned by the government, they are controlled by the ruling party. They are an independent body that isn't elected. Number 2, we told you that it is simply untrue that you get promoted just because you publish more biased articles, because that's not how promotion works in the media. Because if you promote such biased articles, people won't believe you, people will criticize your articles, which means you're far less likely to be promoted. But thirdly, because if it is seen that a politician is trying to influence state media, that is incredibly unpopular, because it seems like you're infringing on the norms of democracy. Note the fact that democratic ideals matter far more than any type of political ideal. So when these types of people are seen as putting in their liberal conservative ideas into the media, you're seen as undemocratic and you're delegitimized. That is something that most ruling parties don't want to go through, because it seems as if you're far less likely to ever be elected. But more importantly, we told you, we gave you 3 perverse incentives of state media. Number 1, we told you they were about a media that was controlled in private. Number 1, that they were highly partisan in nature. Number 2, that because they prioritized profit, they were far more likely to sensationalize media and focus on shocking stories rather than actual stories. But thirdly, because there was often retaliation involved, because they wanted to get ahead of other media sources. We told you, when we removed profit out of this formula, we made media better in 2 ways. Number 1, information was far less politically oriented. But number 2, governments have incentives to be inclusive and to not divide people. Note the fact on their side that oftentimes private media seeks to create a loyal, if not small, fan base that they appeal to. None of that exists because governments seek to be inclusive to everyone. Finally, I want to talk about the idea of an informed electorate. And this is where I would directly deal with their extension. Because what they had to do was prove why private media organizations were more likely to promote views of minorities. We think the government is far more likely because they are accountable to the ballot box and minority votes, while corporations exclude minorities because they aren't shareholders. But most importantly of all, they never talked about the benefits of people who don't consume media on their side of the house. Because there are disenchanted people that feel like media is clearly a mudslinging game that they don't want to participate in. We include these people and give them an outlet to read media for the very first time when the state is involved. But more importantly, we talked about the idea of accessibility. Because yes, media exists, but it doesn't exist for everyone. And that's why when subscriptions $10 a month, that is not a subscription that is available to a normal working class voter. We get these paywalls and we bring them down, make it accessible to every single person. But finally, we told you that people on our side of the house are far more likely to consume a diversity and multiplicity of different media sources, because they aren't so opposed to consuming state media in the same way they are opposed to consuming CNN or Fox News. Because we stood for individuals, we stood on the side of opposition.
This speech was 8 minutes and 12 seconds. I would like to thank the third speaker of the side opposition for their speech, and would like to invite the reply speaker of the side opposition.
I think Proposition's case had a fundamental misunderstanding, because they assumed that countries in the vote were countries that were democracies. But even from Team China, we told you that was probably not true. Because oftentimes democracies meant that you defended liberal values, that regardless of partisanship, you believed in things, like the freedoms and liberties of individuals. You believed in free speech, you believed in free expression, and you believed in free media and press. And that became extremely important, because that context undermined a lot of their argumentation, things on states indoctrinating people, or pressing anti-establishment views, because those were probably not the context of today's debate. Those were probably the examples of states that pretended to be democracies, but in reality were just oppressing autocracies. But even if we were to accept the Orwellian concept of what a democracy is, we still explain to you that when state oppression occurs on our side, it also occurs on their side. But the difference is that media is something that people are geared to spot out. That the biases that may come through opinions that are pro-establishment or ones that only favor the state were the ones where people could realize that there was some sort of bias going on. On their side, they had to defend the same autocratic states, the same oppressive democracies that pretended to be democracies, but on their side it would be done through much more subtle things, like changing the curriculums and the education of the people. Things that were much harder to notice, much harder to stop, and much harder to realize and back against. We think that was the first misunderstanding, that the context of today's debate was something more than just countries that were able to vote, but rather countries that actually believed in the free media and the free press. But the second misunderstanding, I think, was highlighted in the case shift that came from opposition. That is, from first speaker, they told us that the problem in today's debate is that government media is legitimized because it is run by the government. But no, by third speaker, they tell us that government media is problematic because it shifts people's perceptions in subtle ways. And the reason why they shifted that case was they realized that government being legitimized was not the reason or not the problem of media. And the point at which they shifted their argument to the subtle nuances and emotional plays of media, that became an argument not against state media, but against all media in general. Because the unfortunate reality was these subtle ploys are not unique to government media, and thus that meant that their case probably missed entirely what this debate was supposed to be about. So what then do the two worlds look like at the end of today's debate? Their world was probably one that was problematic. Why? Because they stood for the for-profit news organizations as the bastions of media. But we told you that these were the ones that were profit incentivized, and thus were more likely going to be polarized or partisan, more likely to sensationalize and distort media, and more likely to be news agencies that attacked one another rather than the critical nature of truth. We then told you what was worse on their side. Because people who wanted to consume government media were denied on their side. People who couldn't afford to pay expensive paywalls were ignored on their side. Individuals that had unprofitable or unpopular opinions were rejected on their side. And individuals who were disenfranchised because the partisan nature of media in the modern context of democracy did not appeal to their values were also ignored on our side. Why then was it much more preferable to have a world that combined both the for-profit organizations, yet still allowed media to fill in the holes that they were unwilling to stand for? Because it meant that we stood for the government's burden to provide information. Because we told you democracies had two important differences. Firstly, that the governments believed in partisanship values, believed in democratic values beyond just partisanship values. It meant that free speech and free media were protected. But secondly, we told you that these were populations that were engaged and willing to doubt governments because that was the only reason why the vote was important to an individual. Importantly, this then meant that our side was probably one that was able to defend free speech to the maximum possible extent. Because we understood that while state media, even in the worst case scenario, could be a little bit biased, those were biases that were countered by the for-profit organizations. But on their side, when you completely eliminate state media, you take away all the representation for the people that were only able to gain access through media because the state was willing to fund it. You disenfranchise all the individuals who had opinions that for-profit organizations were unwilling to cater to. Because we stood for those people, we were very proud to oppose.
This speech was 4 minutes, 15 seconds. I would like to thank the Vice Speaker of the side opposition for their speech, and would like to invite the Vice Speaker of the side proposition to deliver their speech.
From the get-go, team proposition protects subtle nuances that the state media uses to coerce people. The example of the BBC portraying only one side of Brexit negotiations isn't an explicitly coercive mechanism that the majority of British people understand. We told you from the first speech onwards that the state is using subtle things to influence the way that people understand the world, understand the state, how people react to the things the state is trying to do, and how the things that the state is saying. Team China mischaracterizes the way that we have debated this debate, and we want you to understand this mischaracterization. We think that Team China in this debate needed to engage with the big picture. They needed to engage with all of the examples, and not only say that the United States already has many things that we are characterizing. Because the United States isn't the best example of state media in space. We think that these examples are widely out of the debate, because the United States doesn't have a very strong state media. We don't think that they can only win this debate by saying that things are different in the United States. Two things I want to talk about in this speech. Firstly, I want to give you a characterization of what the state is, and tell you what the side opposition has protected. But secondly, what does the media actually look like, and why would we better under side opposition? Two questions under the characterization of the state. Firstly, is the state an actual authority? In my POI about why people pay taxes and follow laws, for example, the only answer that we get is because otherwise people would be harmed. We can see to this fact, and we understand that people would be harmed. But notice that people don't question the harm that they would get if they don't follow these things. They don't say that I always disagree with all of the laws that exist in my country, or that I fundamentally disagree with the taxation system. It's a coercive mechanism that makes people believe that the state is legitimate, that makes people believe that all the things that the state is forcing them to do are legitimate. People agree to the limitations that the state is putting onto them because of the fact that the state is coercive, and because of the fact that the state can influence how these people live their lives. Their analysis about voting is explicitly under our side. People want to have some kind of balance over the way that the state is having this immense power over people and how these people live their lives. And secondly, what is actually a democracy? Because we can get different things. We think that democracy can be different things. We think that there is a spectrum. We think that Poland might be on one end of the spectrum, but all of the democracies that they are describing are on the other end. We might agree that Poland maybe is more autocratic, but we tell you that it can be more autocratic because of the fact that they can own all of these media organizations. They never give you examples of what are these hugely liberal countries and why the model even applies there. They aren't engaging with a majority of the cases, thus they can't win the debate. They don't even give you an example of the hugely liberal countries who follow all of these democratic principles to such a large extent. Therefore, we believe that our characterization of the state stays on top. We have proven to you how the state is an authority, and furthermore how these democracies can be different, and how our case applies in all of these instances, because all of these democracies want to stay in power, all of these politicians want to be the ones running these states, and therefore they have an incentive to influence the way the media works. Secondly, what does this media actually look like? They never engage with the fact that even if Theresa May can't choose the editor of BBC, then Theresa May can choose who chooses the editor of BBC. Theresa May has power over what kind of media BBC actually presents. Second, but let's look at the things that we have for them. They tell you that people are now going to be more into clickbait. They never answer the fact that people are going to make those private providers match the quality of the media the state provided to them. They still want the same level of media if they didn't watch clickbait before. So therefore they think that this argument truly stands, and they never show you how more people are going to want clickbait news if the same media doesn't exist. But furthermore, the state can illegitimize certain views, and that's something that's very harmful on our side. Notice that this is harmful because the state does it implicitly. Because of the fact that Fox News doesn't have the same incentives as the state, it does it very explicitly and tells people what their views are. This means that people can reject their views if they don't agree with them. This is a protection mechanism that people never have underside opposition, which they can't explicitly understand the ways that the state is coercing them and influencing them to think in a certain way. Team proposition protects one in which people can realize what information is being fed to them and can actually describe the world that they want to live in because of the information that they get based on their own biases. For all of these reasons, proposition